Imagine this. You're sitting on a bus or in a job interview, or talking to a complete stranger. They lean in close, and with a calm, quiet confidence, they whisper a secret to you. A secret that no one else in the world could possibly know. A memory from your childhood, a private fear, a lie you told just yesterday. Because the secret is yours. Today, we are going to share 5 true, chilling accounts of people who encountered a stranger who knew everything about them. We all carry them, don't we? Those secret thoughts, those private moments, those things we've done that we lock away in the deepest vaults of our minds. Our secrets are what make us individuals. They are the very foundation of our privacy. The most terrifying thought imaginable is not that a stranger might harm you, but that a stranger might know you completely and utterly. It's a violation of the soul, a psychological invasion that leaves you naked and exposed, forcing you to ask the terrifying question, how? But what if these weren't random encounters? What if they were messages? By exploring these real, impossible stories, from a stranger on a bus to a therapist whose patient began describing her own nightmares, we will delve into the chilling possibility that our minds are not as secure as we think. These stories are a disturbing look at the invisible threads that connect us and the terrifying reality of what happens when a stranger starts pulling on them. Now, before we expose these secrets, make sure you are subscribed to Whispered Fear and have activated the bell. You wouldn't want the world to know what you're really thinking.
I know you can hear my name.
Our first story is about the ghosts we carry within us. Not the supernatural kind, but the ghosts of memory, of guilt, of secrets buried so deep we convince ourselves they no longer exist. It comes from a woman named Eleanor who learned that no secret is ever truly buried, and that sometimes a complete stranger can reach into the deepest, most fortified vault of your mind and speak your forgotten sins back to you. At 42, Eleanor's life was a carefully curated fortress of solitude. She worked as an archivist for the University of Washington's Cicero Library in Seattle, a job that suited her perfectly. Her world was one of quiet, ordered history, of acid-free paper and the gentle scent of decaying books. She spent her days preserving other people's pasts, a task that allowed her to conveniently ignore her own. After a messy divorce years earlier, she had cultivated a life of quiet, predictable routines. Her small, overpriced apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood was her sanctuary, a place where the chaotic world was kept at bay by a sturdy deadbolt and the comforting anonymity of a large, indifferent city. Her daily commute was the central pillar of this routine. Every morning, she would walk from her apartment on 15th Avenue East down to East John Street to catch the King County Metro's Route 10 bus. Every evening, she would reverse the journey. The bus was her moving sanctuary, a non-space where she was surrounded by people, but utterly alone. She would put in her earbuds, not to listen to music, but to create a barrier of silence and stare out the window at the familiar, rain-slicked streets of Seattle. It was a life of quiet, controlled, and deeply lonely precision. This particular Tuesday in October began like any other. The Seattle sky was a familiar, bruised purple canvas, a persistent drizzle misting the air. Her day at the library was long, spent meticulously cataloging a collection of old maritime maps. At 7 p.m., she packed her bag, said a quiet goodnight to the evening security guard, and began her journey home. She caught the 7:15 p.m. bus. The familiar hiss of its air brakes, a comforting, rhythmic sound. She found her usual seat, a single spot on the right side, just behind the rear doors, and settled in for the 30-minute ride. The bus was moderately crowded, a typical mix of students, service workers, and weary professionals. Eleanor put in her earbuds, the silicone tips a welcome seal against the world, and rested her head against the cool glass of the window. watching the city lights blur into streaks of neon color. At the stop on 10th Avenue, near the edge of the Seattle University campus, the bus emptied out a little. A few people got off. A few got on. One of them, a man, walked down the aisle and, to her mild annoyance, sat in the empty seat directly next to her. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the window, a silent, universally understood signal of do not engage. He was just a presence, a neutral space beside her. She could smell the faint, clean scent of rain on his coat. She could feel the slight shift in the seat's cushion as he settled in. For several blocks, he was just a stranger, a temporary, anonymous neighbor in the small, moving village of the bus. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud. It was a low, quiet murmur, barely audible over the rumble of the engine, but it cut through the silence of her earbuds like a razor. "The little yellow boat," he said. Eleanor's entire body went rigid. The world seemed to tilt and narrow, focusing down to the impossible, terrifying reality of those 4 words. She slowly, so slowly, turned her head away from the window and looked at him for the first time. He was the most unremarkable man she had ever seen. He was probably in his late 60s, with thinning gray hair, a kind, wrinkled face, and pale blue eyes behind a pair of simple, wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a simple beige raincoat. He looked like someone's grandfather. A retired teacher, perhaps. There was absolutely nothing menacing about him, and that made it so much worse. Her voice was a strained whisper, her mind already a frantic storm of denial. "I'm sorry?" She must have misheard him. The old man turned to look at her, a gentle, almost apologetic smile on his face. He repeated, his voice still a quiet murmur, "The little yellow boat, the one with the blue sail. You told him it would be an adventure. You told him the creek was a big, big ocean." The air left Eleanor's lungs in a silent, horrified rush. It wasn't a random phrase. It was a direct quote, a verbatim transcript from a memory she had buried for 35 years. A memory so dark, so poisoned with guilt, that she had never spoken of it to another living soul. Not to her parents, not to her therapist, not even to her ex-husband. It was her secret, her original sign. When she was 7 years old, she had a younger brother, a bright, curious 4-year-old boy named Sam. One spring afternoon, they were playing by the creek that ran behind their childhood home in a rural corner of Oregon. He had a small plastic toy sailboat, a cheap little thing, yellow with a single blue sail. She, in a moment of childish arrogance and a desire to be the older, wiser sister, had dared him. She had told him the boat was a real ship, that the creek was a mighty ocean, and that a real captain would go on an adventure. He had believed her. He had waded into the fast-moving, rain-swollen creek to launch his little boat, and he had been swept away. They had found his small, lifeless body a mile downstream, tangled in the roots of a willow tree. His little yellow boat was found days later, washed up on a sandbar. You told him it would be an adventure. The words, spoken by this complete stranger in this public space, were a violation so profound it was almost physical. It was as if he had reached into her skull, rummaged through the darkest, most cobwebbed corner of her memory, and pulled out her most precious and terrible secret. She whispered, her voice trembling, her mind a blank slate of pure shock. "Who are you?" The man's gentle smile never wavered. He said softly, "That doesn't matter. What matters is that you stop blaming yourself. It wasn't your fault. You were just a child." His words, meant perhaps to be a comfort, were a new kind of terror. He didn't just know the secret. He knew the guilt. He knew the silent psychological burden she had carried her entire life. The secret belief that she had, in effect, killed her own brother. She scrambled to her feet, her bag falling to the floor, its contents spilling into the aisle. She hissed, her voice a raw, ragged sound. "Stay away from me." The few other passengers in the car looked up, their faces masks of mild, disinterested curiosity. The old man didn't move. He just looked at her with those pale, kind, terrifyingly knowing eyes. "It's all right." "Eleanor," he said. He knew her name. That was the final, shattering blow. She didn't wait for more. She pushed her way down the aisle, stumbling over her own feet, and half fell out of the bus at the next stop on East Madison Street, a full mile from her own. She ran. She ran without looking back, the sound of the bus's air brakes hissing behind her like a mocking laugh. She ran until she reached the relative safety of Cal Anderson Park, collapsing onto a wet bench under the glare of the park lights, her body racked with a combination of terror and racking 35-year-old sobs. How? How could he possibly know? The logical part of her mind, the archivist, the part that dealt in facts and evidence, was screaming for an explanation. Had she told someone? A therapist, years ago, whose records had been breached. A drunken confession to a friend she had forgotten. She spent the next hour on that cold, wet bench, frantically sifting through the archives of her own life, searching for a source, a leak. There was none. She had never told anyone. She finally made her way home, a ghost in her own city. She locked her door, slid the chain, and leaned against it, her body trembling. Her sanctuary was no longer safe. Her solitude had been a lie. If a stranger on a bus knew her deepest secret, then privacy was an illusion. The next few days were a waking nightmare of paranoia. Every stranger on the street was him. Every quiet, elderly man she saw in a coffee shop was him. She changed her commute, taking a different bus route, a train, anything to avoid the Route 10. She started looking over her shoulder. The fortress of her quiet, ordered life had been breached, and she didn't know how to repair the walls. She began a frantic, obsessive digital archaeology of her own life. She scoured her old social media accounts, her long-forgotten blogs from college, her email archives, searching for any mention of Sam, of the boat, of the accident. She found nothing. She had been meticulous in her silence, in her burial of the past. The answer, when it came, was not digital. It was analog. It came in a dusty, forgotten box. A week after the incident on the bus, she was at her mother's house in Tacoma, helping her clear out the garage. Her mother, now in her late 70s, was a woman who never threw anything away. The garage was a museum of their family's life. In the back, under a pile of old canvases, was a box labeled childhood tapes. They were old 8mm home movies, taken by her father on a camera that had been ancient even in the 80s. They hadn't watched them in decades. On a whim, driven by a need to see his face again, she brought the box home. She had to buy an old, used projector from a vintage camera shop in the Fremont neighborhood just to play them. That night, she sat in her dark living room, the whirring of the old projector a loud, mechanical sound. She watched the silent, flickering ghosts of her past play out on the bare, white wall. There was Sam, a gap-toothed toddler, laughing on a swing. There was her, a serious little girl with pigtails. There was her father, young and smiling. She watched a reel labeled Summer '88. The footage showed a family picnic by the creek behind their old house. And there it was, a scene she had no memory of, but her subconscious recognized instantly. The footage showed her, age 7, talking to her little brother, Sam. He was holding the small, yellow toy boat. The silent film showed her pointing emphatically at the creek, her expression serious, bossy. It showed him looking up at her with a child's perfect, unwavering trust. And it showed a third person in the frame. He was standing in the background, by the edge of the woods. A young man, probably in his late teens, a neighbor's cousin who had been at the picnic, a boy whose name she had long forgotten. He was holding the camera, filming them. But just before the scene cut, He lowered the camera, and the film captured him for just a second, looking at the two of them, a strange, sad, knowing smile on his face. And standing next to him, his hand on the young man's shoulder, was his father, a kind-faced, elderly man with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. The man from the bus. A memory, a detail she hadn't thought of in decades, suddenly surfaced. The neighbor's family. They had a son who was a budding filmmaker, and his grandfather, a retired professor, was visiting that summer. They had been there. They had seen it all. They had a recording of it. The man on the bus wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a psychic. He was a witness. A silent witness who had carried the knowledge of her secret for 35 years. But that didn't answer the biggest question. Why? Why now? Why, after all these years, had he sought her out on a random Tuesday night? On a city bus, 100 miles from where it all happened? Was it a threat? Blackmail? She spent the next week in a new kind of fear. A fear not of the unknown, but of the known. She researched the family. The boy who had filmed the home movie was now a documentary. Filmmaker living in Portland, the grandfather. She found his obituary. He had passed away 3 years ago. So the man on the bus, he hadn't been the grandfather. He had been a ghost after all. A ghost of a memory, somehow given form. The final impossible piece of the puzzle arrived in her mailbox a few days later. It was a small, padded envelope with no return address. The postmark was from Seattle. Inside was a single mini DV tape and a small, folded note. The note was written in a shaky, elderly hand. It read, "My name is Arthur. You don't know me, but my son was the boy who filmed your home movie all those years ago. He told me the story. He was haunted by it, by your secret. He became obsessed. After my wife passed, his obsession grew. He started changing. He would dress like me, talk like me. He would tell me stories from my own past as if he had lived them. The doctors called it a dissociative disorder, a fugue state. Sometimes he thinks he is me. I am so sorry. He followed you to Seattle. He thinks he needs to absolve you. He is not a monster. He is just a sick, sad man who has been carrying your ghost and mine for a very long time. This is a copy of his last documentary. I think you need to see it." Eleanor's hands were trembling so hard she could barely insert the tape into her old DV camera. She pressed play. The screen flickered to life. It was footage of the man on the bus. Not the old man, but a man who looked like him. It was a documentary. Seemingly filmed by the man himself. It was a strange, rambling, obsessive piece of work. A collage of old home movies. Interviews with himself, where he played both himself and his own father. And hidden camera footage. The last 10 minutes of the film were a single static shot of her on the bus, taken from a hidden camera in the button of a coat. She watched herself, staring out the window, unaware. And then she heard it. The voice of the man, her neighbor's son, a man named Mark, now in his 50s, narrating over the footage, his voice a perfect imitation of his deceased father's. The voice said, "She carries it still, the weight of the little yellow boat. 35 years. It's time. A kindness is owed, a story for a story, a ghost for a ghost. She needs to know it wasn't her fault. I need to tell her." The film ended. Eleanor sat in her silent apartment, the truth a terrible, heartbreaking weight in her chest. The man on the bus hadn't been a ghost. He hadn't been a monster. He was a broken man, a man so haunted by a secret that wasn't his, that his own mind had fractured, turning him into the ghost of his own father. He had found her not to threaten her, but to offer a strange, twisted form of absolution. A final desperate act from a mind lost at sea. She was left with a horrifying, tragic knowledge. Her secret hadn't just destroyed her brother. It had created a second victim, a quiet, collateral damage in the shrapnel of her own past. The man on the bus wasn't her ghost. She was his.
Tell me everything.
Our next story is about a different kind of encounter. It's not about a ghost on a bus or a whisper in the dark. It's about the bright, sterile, fluorescent-lit terror of a corporate job interview. It comes from a man named Alex, who learned that in the modern world, the most terrifying monsters don't wear masks or carry knives. They wear tailored suits, sit on the other side of a polished mahogany desk, and they come armed with your deepest, most carefully buried secret. At 29, Alex felt like he was drowning. 6 months ago, he had been a rising star, a senior financial analyst at a respectable firm in his hometown of Columbia, South Carolina. He had a life plan, a neat 5-year projection that was as clean and logical as the spreadsheets he built. Then came the merger. His position was declared redundant, a sterile corporate word for "you're finished." His life plan was deleted. The 6 months since had been a slow, grinding descent into a very quiet, very personal hell. He had burned through his savings, the weight of his student loans, a physical presence in his small apartment. The worst part was the shame. The calls to his parents, the forced optimism in his voice, the quiet pity in theirs. He was a failure, a man adrift. Then, after hundreds of applications sent into the digital void, a miracle happened. An email from Viridian Dynamics, a high-powered, almost mythical, private equity firm based in Charlotte, North Carolina, thought they were interested. They wanted to interview him for a senior associate position. It wasn't just a job. It was a lifeline. It was a quantum leap up the corporate ladder, a salary that would solve all his problems, a title that would silence the whispers of failure in his own head. For 2 weeks, he lived and breathed the interview. He researched the company, memorized their portfolio, practiced his answers to every conceivable question. His entire future was balanced on the knife's edge of this single 1-hour meeting. The day of the interview was a crisp, clear autumn morning. He drove the 2 hours from Columbia to Charlotte, the skyline of the city growing larger in his windshield, a gleaming Oz of glass and steel. The Viridian Dynamics office was on the top floor of the Bank of America Corporate Center, a place that seemed to exist in a different, more rarefied atmosphere than the rest of the world. He walked into the lobby, his suit feeling cheap, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The office was a masterpiece of cold, minimalist power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the city below. The furniture was sleek, black and uncomfortable looking. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft, almost inaudible hum of a powerful server farm somewhere in the building's core. He was led to a conference room by a silent assistant. The room was just a glass box, with a single massive mahogany table and 2 chairs. He sat and waited, his palms sweating. A few minutes later, the door opened and a man entered. Was in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in a gray, tailored suit. His face was sharp, intelligent, with pale, piercing blue eyes that seemed to analyze everything they looked at. His voice was calm and smooth. Extending a hand. Alex. Arthur Sterling. I'm the head of acquisitions. Thank you for coming in. The interview began as expected. Sterling was tough, his questions precise and probing. He dissected Alex's resume, questioned his past projects, tested his knowledge of market trends. Alex, running on pure adrenaline and weeks of preparation, met every question with a confident, well-reasoned answer. He felt like he was doing well. The initial terror was beginning to fade, replaced by a flicker of hope. He could do this. He belonged here. About 45 minutes into the interview, after a particularly grueling line of questioning about risk assessment models, Sterling leaned back in his chair, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his face. Very impressive. Alex, your technical skills are clearly top-notch. Alex allowed himself a small internal sigh of relief. Sterling continued, his voice still smooth, but with a new, subtle shift in tone. But skills are only half of the equation here at Viridian. We value resilience, character, the ability to handle difficult situations. So, I'd like to move away from the resume for a moment. Let's talk about you. He paused, his pale blue eyes locking onto Alex's. Tell me about a time in your life when you were faced with a significant failure in leadership. Time when your lack of supervision led to a catastrophic and permanent outcome. The question was a bucket of ice water in Alex's face. It was so specific, so strangely phrased. He repeated, buying time, his mind racing through his professional history, searching for an appropriate anecdote. A failure in leadership? Sterling's gaze was unwavering. Yes, a personal failure. Something not on your resume. Something that shaped you. And in that moment, Alex knew. He didn't know how he knew, but a cold, primal certainty washed over him. The question wasn't about work. It was about something else. It was about the one story, the one memory, the one secret he had spent his entire adult life trying to bury. When Alex was 15, he had a younger sister, a bright, fearless, 7-year-old girl named Emily. One summer afternoon, at their family's lake house on Lake Murray, he had been tasked with watching her while their parents were out. He had been a typical, distracted teenager, more interested in the music blasting through his headphones than in his little sister. She had been playing by the edge of the dock, a place she was forbidden to go without a life jacket. He had told her to come back. She had ignored him. He had turned up the music. 10 minutes later, he had looked up and she was gone. They had found her an hour later. It had been a tragic, senseless accident, a failure of supervision, a secret his family had agreed, in a silent, unspoken pact, never to speak of again. It was a ghost that lived in the silent spaces of every family gathering. Alex stammered, his mouth suddenly dry, his carefully constructed professional facade crumbling. I'm not sure I understand the question. Sterling's smile didn't falter. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. He said softly, I think you do. Alex, let's be more specific. Let's talk about the lake. About the dock. About the red life jacket that was left sitting on the bench. Tell me about that failure. The world tilted. The air in the glass-walled conference room seemed to thin, to become hard to breathe. This was impossible. No one knew the detail about the red life jacket on the bench. It wasn't in any police report. It was a small, searing detail that only he and his parents knew. It was the physical proof of his negligence, the thing that haunted his nightmares. Alex's voice was a choked whisper. How do you know that? Sterling said, his voice a calm, chilling statement of fact. We know everything. Alex, Viridian Dynamics doesn't just invest in companies. We invest in people. And we conduct the most thorough due diligence in the industry. We need to know who we're hiring. We need to know their strengths, their weaknesses, their pressure points. We need to know what breaks them. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers on the polished mahogany table. So, tell me, how did you handle the aftermath? The guilt? The silence in your family? The way your mother could barely look at you for a year? Walk me through the emotional logistics of that catastrophic outcome. This wasn't an interview. It was an interrogation. A psychological vivisection. The job, the salary, the lifeline, it was all just bait. The real purpose of this meeting was to see him break. Alex said, finding a spark of anger in his terror. This is insane. You have no right. Sterling replied, his voice still impossibly calm. We have every right. You signed the consent form for our third-party background verification process when you applied. It's all in the fine print. He gestured vaguely at a stack of papers on the table. It's a very comprehensive process. We use a proprietary service, a firm called Erebus Analytics. They don't just check your credit score and your criminal record. They build a complete psychological profile. They scour everything, not just your social media, but your digital. Ghost. Every deleted post from every forgotten forum you ever visited as a teenager. Every piece of data that's ever been breached from every company you've ever done business with. They buy data from aggregators you've never heard of. They use sophisticated AI to analyze patterns, to connect the dots of your life. But the real genius is in the human element. Sterling paused, letting the words sink in. They interview people, old neighbors, estranged family members, that third-grade teacher who thought you had anger issues. They find the people who hold the missing pieces of your life, the ones you've forgotten or tried to forget. They find the cracks in a family's silence, a cousin who drank too much at a wedding, an uncle who holds a grudge. People talk. Alex, especially when they think they're talking to a discreet professional research firm. They just talk. A cold, horrifying clarity washed over Alex. The years of silence in his family hadn't been a perfect seal. It had been a dam, holding back a flood of grief and blame. And Erebus Analytics, this faceless corporate monster, had found the cracks. They had poked and prodded until the dam broke. And his secret, his family's most sacred and painful secret, had come spilling out, collected, collated, and presented in a neat, confidential file that now sat on Arthur Sterling's desk. Alex whispered, the fight gone out of him, replaced by a profound, soul-crushing sense of violation. Why? Because risk is not just in the market, Alex. It's in the people. We need to know how our employees will react under extreme, unthinkable pressure. Will they break? Will they lie? Will they compartmentalize and continue to function? The death of your sister was a tragedy, but for us, it is also a data point, the most reliable data point in your entire life. He stood up, smoothing the front of his perfect gray suit. The technical portion of your interview is over. This is the real interview. Your response to this conversation, right now, will determine whether or not you have a future at this firm. He walked to the door. You have 5 minutes to consider your response and to decide if you are the kind of person who can do what is necessary to succeed. He paused at the door. And for what it's worth, you're handling this better than most. He closed the door, leaving Alex alone in the silent, glass-walled cage, 42 stories above a city that no longer felt real. He was left with a choice that was no choice at all. He could scream, he could rage, he could leave, he could walk out of this sterile corporate torture chamber, back to his life of debt and failure, his most painful trauma now exposed and weaponized. A secret that was no longer his own. Or he could compartmentalize. He could do what was necessary. He could take the shattered pieces of his own soul, lock them in a box, and prove that he was exactly the kind of resilient, broken, and useful monster they were looking for. He stared out the window at the panoramic view of the city, at the endless grid of streets and buildings, a world of verifiable, logical data. He thought about the job, the money, the security. He thought about never having to see that look of pity in his parents' eyes again. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air in the room tasting of glass and steel. He smoothed his tie. He straightened his jacket. He looked at his own reflection in the dark, polished surface of the mahogany table, and he waited for the man who knew his deepest secret to return, ready to give him the answer he wanted to hear.
Read it.
Our next story is about the ghosts that live in our pockets. It's about the small, glowing rectangles we carry with us everywhere. The devices that hold our deepest secrets, our most private conversations, our most carefully constructed lies. Comes from a man named Ethan, who learned that in the modern world, the most terrifying stalker isn't the one who follows your car or watches you through a window. It's the one who is already reading your messages over your shoulder. A silent, invisible passenger in your own digital life. Ethan's lie was born of shame. At 32, his life, once a predictable upward trajectory, had violently derailed. He had been a successful project manager for a commercial construction firm in Denver, Colorado. He had a wife, Jessica, who was 6 months pregnant with their first child. They had just bought a small, charming but financially draining bungalow in the Washington Park neighborhood, a place of old trees and young families. His life was supposed to be perfect, a fortress of impending fatherhood and domestic bliss. 3 weeks ago, that fortress had been breached. The firm had lost a major contract, and his position, along with a dozen others, had been eliminated. He was laid off. The shame was a physical weight, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of his stomach. He looked at his pregnant wife, at the new mortgage payment, at the mountain of impending bills for their unborn child, and he couldn't bring himself to tell her. He couldn't add the burden of his failure to the weight she was already carrying. So he constructed a lie, a simple, stupid, and ultimately catastrophic lie. He told her he was still working. His days became a masterclass in deception. He would get up every morning, put on his suit, kiss his wife goodbye, and leave the house on South Downing Street at precisely 7:30 a.m. But instead of driving to his old office downtown, he would drive to the Denver Public Library, where he would spend his days in a quiet, anonymous carrel, sending out hundreds of resumes into the digital void, his face a mask of calm desperation. He would come home at 6 p.m., exhausted not from work, but from the soul-crushing weight of his performance. His life had become a stage play for an audience of one. This particular Wednesday began with a new layer to the deception. A potential employer, a firm called Mortensen Construction, had called him back. They were interested. They wanted to schedule an interview for the following week. It was the first real flicker of hope he'd had in a month. But the interview was in Lone Tree, a southern suburb, a 45-minute drive from their house. He needed a plausible reason to be gone for that long on a weekday. So he expanded the lie. He said to Jessica that morning, his voice a carefully constructed imitation of casualness, "Hey, honey, good news. I have a big in-person meeting today with some potential investors for the new project. It's out at the Charles Schwab campus in Lone Tree, so I'll probably be home a little late," she'd said, her smile genuine and full of a pride that felt like a knife in his gut. "That's wonderful, Ethan." He didn't have a meeting. He spent the day at his usual spot in the library, his mind a frantic mess. On the drive home, the guilt was so overwhelming he couldn't face the silence of his own car. He needed a buffer. He needed a drink. He pulled off I-25 and into the parking lot of a small, nondescript bar in the Baker neighborhood called The Hornet. It was a place he'd never been, anonymous and dark. He sat at the bar, ordered a single beer, and stared at his own reflection in the mirror behind the rows of bottles. He was a stranger to himself, a man living a life of quiet, desperate fraud. He stayed for exactly 1 hour, watching the traffic pass by outside the window, then paid in cash and left. He got home at 6:30 p.m. Jessica greeted him with a hug. "How did it go?" she asked. He lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It went well. Really well, I think." They had dinner. They talked about names for the baby. They watched a show. It was a perfect, normal evening, built on a foundation of lies. Later that night, as they were getting ready for bed, his phone, which was on the kitchen counter, buzzed with an incoming text message. He glanced at it. The message was from a number he didn't recognize, an out-of-state area code. He assumed it was spam, another political survey, or a fake package delivery notice. He was about to delete it, but the preview of the text on his lock screen made his blood run cold. The text read, Hoped the meeting at the Schwab campus went well. Tough crowd. He stared at the screen, his heart a sudden cold fist in his chest. A prank? A wrong number? But it was too specific. It knew about the meeting. It knew the location. His mind raced. Had he told anyone else? A friend? No, he had been too ashamed. Only Jessica knew. Jessica asked, coming up behind him. "Who's that?" He said quickly, shoving the phone into his pocket. No one. Just a spam text. He went to the bathroom and locked the door. His hands shaking, he pulled out the phone and read the message again. The words seemed to mock him from the glowing screen. Who could have sent this? A former colleague playing. A cruel joke? He tried calling the number. A recorded voice, cold and robotic, informed him that the number was not in service. He spent a sleepless night, his mind a looping nightmare of possibilities. The next day, he was a wreck, jumping at every buzz of his phone. He tried to act normal, but the secret message was a ticking bomb in his pocket. The second text arrived that evening, just as he was sitting down to dinner with Jessica. The same unknown number. This time, the message was a single, chilling sentence. "The Hornet has a surprisingly good IPA on tap, doesn't it?" The world tilted. The sounds of the kitchen, the smell of the food, his wife's voice, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. This wasn't a guess. This wasn't a prank. The Hornet. The anonymous, forgotten bar he had stopped at on his way home. The one place he was certain no one had seen him. Jessica's voice broke through the fog. "Ethan, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He forced a smile, his face feeling like a cheap plastic mask. "Yeah, just a long day." This was no longer a coincidence. This was surveillance. Someone was watching him. Someone who knew about the lie he had told his wife, and who also knew the truth of where he had actually been. Someone who was toying with him, pulling the strings of his secret life. The paranoia was immediate and all-consuming. He started checking his car for GPS trackers. He ran anti-spyware software on his phone and his laptop, searching for a digital breach. He found nothing. He started looking over his shoulder on the street, scanning the faces in the library, searching for anyone who seemed too interested, too watchful. The anonymity he had once found in the city was gone, replaced by the terrifying certainty that he was the star of a show he didn't know he was in. He thought about telling Jessica, but how? The conversation would begin with his own confession, his own betrayal. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, and the warden, whoever it was sending him mocking little messages from the outside. The texts continued, one every day, each one a small, perfect, terrifying detail from his secret life. "The librarian at the DPL looks tired today. You almost got a parking ticket on Acoma Street. Close one. Saw you looking at the baby strollers on Amazon again. You're going to be a great dad." The last one was the most insidious thought. It was a compliment wrapped around a threat. A reminder that the stalker wasn't just watching his failures, but his hopes and dreams as well. They were inside his phone, inside his browsing history, inside his head. He was coming apart at the seams. He wasn't sleeping. He was barely eating. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted by a digital phantom that knew him better than anyone. He knew he was on the verge of a full-blown breakdown. He had to know who was doing this. He had to confront them. The final text, the one that led to the horrifying revelation, arrived a week after the first. It was different. It wasn't a statement. It was a question. "Did you know that Jessica's favorite flowers are white lily? They'd look beautiful on a grave." That was it. The line had been crossed. This was no longer a game. This was a direct, unambiguous threat against his wife, against his unborn child. Rage, pure and white-hot, burned through his fear. He didn't think. He reacted. He typed a reply, his thumbs flying across the screen. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" He hit send. And for the first time, he got a reply almost instantly. It was a single, hyperlinked phrase. The text simply read, "Click here to see who is watching." He stared at the link, his heart pounding. This was it. The confrontation. He knew it was a risk, a virus, a trap. But he didn't care. He had to. No. He took a deep breath and tapped the link. It opened his web browser to a sleek, professional-looking website. The logo at the top read, Ambience Analytics. Know your subject. The site was a login page. But below the login fields, there was a promotional video. He pressed play. A smooth, corporate, male voice began to narrate over stock footage of data streams and smiling business people. In today's world, information is everything. But data is messy. Ambience Analytics provides a solution. We offer a bespoke, subscription-based human intelligence service. We don't just find public records. We create a living, breathing, real-time portrait of your subject. The video cut to an animation. Using a proprietary network of data brokers, digital surveillance tools, and on-the-ground human assets, we provide our clients with a complete 360-degree view of a person's life. Their movements, their purchases, their online searches, their private conversations. Everything. Know your business partner. Know your political rival. Know your cheating spouse. The screen showed a mock-up of the service's dashboard. It was a map. With a blinking blue dot next to it was a live feed of text messages, social media posts, and a list of recent purchases. It was a stalker's paradise, packaged and sold as a corporate tool. The narrator continued, as the animation showed a calendar event labeled Meeting with Investors, being cross-referenced with a credit card charge at a bar. Our automated system flags inconsistencies between a subject's stated actions and their actual behavior. Our clients can even choose to be notified of these inconsistencies in real time via an anonymous, untraceable text message. The blood drained from Ethan's face. The man in the suit from the interview. The wrong number text. The voice of his dead grandmother. It was all a service. A product. His deepest secrets, his most private moments, his carefully constructed lies were just data points, packaged and sold to the highest bidder. But who was the client? Who had bought a subscription to his life? He looked at the website again. And he saw it. At the bottom of the page, in small gray text, was a single line. Forgot your password? Click here. He tapped it. The page reloaded. Please enter the email address associated with your account. With a trembling, sickening certainty, he knew there was only one other person who would care this much, who would be this invested in the intimate details of his every failure. He slowly, deliberately typed in his wife's email address. The page reloaded. And a new message appeared on the screen in crisp, black, corporate font. Password reset link has been sent to jessica.carter@gmail.com. He looked up from his phone across the living room to where Jessica was sitting on the couch, knitting a small yellow baby blanket. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw past the warm, loving smile. He saw the cold, analytical glint in her eyes. The same glint he had seen in the eyes of Arthur Sterling, the man from Viridian Dynamics. The same glint he saw in his own reflection every single morning. She knew. She had known all along. She hadn't been a victim of his lies. She had been the auditor, and the text messages hadn't been a threat from a stranger. They had been a performance review, a test, a final terrifying interview to see if he was worthy of being a father, a husband. An interview he had just failed. The final, horrifying truth clicked into place. The whisper he'd been hearing wasn't from a stalker. It was from the infrastructure of a world where there are no more secrets, where every lie is a data point for sale. And he was left with the chilling knowledge that the fortress of his life hadn't been breached by an enemy. It had been bugged from the inside. by the one person he thought he could trust, and he knew with a certainty that was the death of all hope, that she was still watching.
Forgive me, Father, for you have sinned.
Our next story is about the sanctity of secrets and the terrifying possibility that the walls we build to protect our souls are made of glass. It comes from a man of God, a priest named Father Michael, who learned that the confessional is not a place of absolution, but a box of echoes, and that sometimes the penitent who comes to you seeking forgiveness for their sins is actually there to remind you of your own. Father Michael Callahan was, by all accounts, a good priest. At 52, he had been the rector of St. Stephen's Catholic Church in Boston's North End for nearly a decade. The church, a historic brick edifice on Hanover Street, was his life. It was a sanctuary not just for his parishioners, but for him. He found a profound, quiet purpose in its rituals, the scent of old incense and beeswax, the way the late afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows, the hushed reverence of Sunday Mass. His life was one of service, of quiet contemplation, a life lived for others. It was a life he had chosen, in part, to outrun the man he had been before the collar, before the vows, before the quiet cobbled streets of the North End. He had a secret, a single, defining sin from his life as a young man in South Boston, a ghost from a past he had confessed to God 1,000 times, but had never spoken of to another living soul. It was a memory locked in a vault so deep, so secure, that he had convinced himself it was truly buried. He was a good priest. He was a forgiven man. He was safe. The confession that would shatter his world began on a cold, rainy Tuesday evening in November. The church was empty, the sounds of the city muffled by the thick stone walls and the steady drumming of rain against the roof. It was late, past 8 p.m. Confession hours had officially ended, but Father Michael always stayed a little longer, a quiet offering for any soul who might need it. He sat in the familiar, cramped darkness of the confessional, a space that felt more like a part of his own body than a piece of furniture. He could hear the faint, rhythmic creak of the old church settling, the hiss of the radiator. He was about to leave when he heard it, the soft creak of the kneeler on the other side of the screen. Someone had come in. He straightened his stole, composed himself, and prepared to be a vessel for God's grace. He made the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. A voice from the other side of the dark, lattice screen whispered back, Amen. It was a voice he didn't recognize that it was a man's voice, but it was soft, raspy, and had a strange, almost neutral quality to it, devoid of any discernible age or accent. The voice said, the familiar words a strange counterpoint to the unfamiliar tone. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been a very long time since my last confession. Father Michael replied, his own voice the warm, practiced baritone of a seasoned priest. The Lord is merciful, my son. What is it that troubles your soul? There was a long pause. So long, in fact, that Michael began to wonder if the man had left. He could hear the soft, shallow sound of his breathing on the other side of the screen. The man finally whispered, I was dishonest. In what way, my son? Another long, heavy pause. I took something that wasn't mine. A long time ago, when I was a young man. Father Michael waited. This was a common confession, a sin of youth, easily absolved. He prompted gently. Go on. The voice rasped, the words slow and deliberate. It was a summer night. Hot. The air was thick. You could smell the salt from the harbor. We were on the docks. Not the new ones. The old, forgotten ones, down past the Seaport District, near the old abandoned warehouses. The wood of the pier was rotten. In places, a cold, tiny needle of unease pricked at the back of Michael's mind. The details were specific. Too specific. They were painting a picture he had spent half his life trying to burn from his memory. He shifted in his seat, the leather of the old chair groaning in protest. The voice continued, still in that flat, emotionless tone. There were three of us, just kids, really, full of cheap beer and the kind of stupid, pointless anger that only young men can have. And there was another boy, a smaller boy. He had a mouth on him. He said the wrong thing to the wrong person. The needle of unease became a spike of pure, cold dread. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the blood draining from his face. This wasn't a random confession. The voice whispered, "We didn't mean for it to go so far, Dodd. It was just a fight. A stupid drunken fight." But he fell. He hit his head on a rusted iron cleat on the edge of the pier. There was so much blood. He didn't get up. Michael's mind was screaming, "Stop. Stop talking." But he was a priest. In the sanctity of the confessional, he was bound by a sacred oath to listen. He was a prisoner of his own holy office. The voice continued, a new, almost clinical detachment in its tone. "We panicked. We knew we were in trouble. So we made a decision. A terrible decision. We took his wallet to make it look like a robbery. And then we rolled him off the pier and into the dark, cold water of the harbor. The priest's carefully constructed world, his fortress of faith and forgiveness, shattered into a million pieces. The man on the other side of the screen was not just confessing his sin. He was confessing his sin. Michael's sin. The single, defining, life-altering event from his past. A past, he thought, was known only to him, to God, and to the two other men who had been there that night. Two men he hadn't seen or spoken to in 30 years. Michael's voice was a choked, strangled sound, nothing like the calm, compassionate voice of Father Michael Dodd. It was the voice of Michael Callahan, the terrified 19-year-old boy on the dock. How do you know this? The figure on the other side of the screen let out a soft, dry, rustling sound that might have been a laugh. "Father, I am the one confessing. This is my sin, not yours. Are you confused?" The question was a masterpiece of psychological cruelty. The ambiguity, the feigned innocence. Was this one of the other two men from that night? Their mind broken by decades of guilt? Or was this something else? Something impossible? "Michael," demanded, his voice a harsh whisper, all pretense of the sacrament gone. "Who are you?" The voice replied, its tone still maddeningly calm. "I am a sinner, seeking absolution. The police, they never found the body. The tide took it out to sea. They ruled it a runaway case. A troubled kid who just disappeared. We were safe. We were free. But the guilt, Father, the guilt is a heavy thing to carry." The voice paused, and Michael could feel the man on the other side lean closer to the screen, his whisper now intimate, conspiratorial. "But you know that, don't you, Michael? You know how heavy it is. You know how it follows you, how it wakes you up at night, Dodd. You know how it drove you to this dark little box, listening to other people's sins, a desperate, lifelong attempt to atone for your own. This was no longer a confession. It was a vivisection. The man, whoever he was, didn't just know the story. He knew the aftermath. He knew the silent psychological architecture of Michael's entire life. He knew the secret reason he had become a priest. Michael hissed, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "What do you want?" "I want what everyone who comes in here wants," the voice said. "Forgiveness. But before you can grant it to me, we must be honest. We must confess everything. For instance, the lie we told ourselves, that it was an accident. It wasn't, was it? We saw he was still breathing when we rolled him into the water. We chose to let him drown. We chose to save ourselves. The detail was so specific, so secret, a truth that Michael had never even admitted to himself in the darkest hours of his own private confessions. It was the final, undeniable proof. This was not a guess. This was not a coincidence. This was an intimate, absolute knowledge. Michael whispered, the last of his strength, his faith, his identity, draining away. How are you doing this? We are confessing, the voice said. Together. You and I.W. must be thorough. We must remember everything. Like the way his eyes looked just before we let go. The surprise. The betrayal and the fear. So much fear. Michael could take no more. He stood up, a raw, animal sound of pure terror tearing from his throat. He threw open the door of his side at the confessional and stumbled out into the dim, empty church. He ran to the other side, to the penitent's door, and ripped it open. The small, dark space was empty. The kneeler was still warm. The air was thick with the faint scent of rain and old wool, but the man was gone. He had vanished into thin air, leaving only the echo of his impossible confession hanging in the silent church. Michael stood there in the vast, empty space, his body trembling, his mind a shattered wreck. He was no longer Father Michael, the rector, the man of God. He was just Michael Callahan, the boy on the dock, his sin as fresh and raw as it had been 30 years ago. The next few days were a living hell of paranoia and fear. Every shadow in the church seemed to hold the quiet, whispering man. Every parishioner who came to him with a troubled soul felt like a potential accuser. The sanctity of the confessional, the one place he had felt truly safe, was now a torture chamber. He had to know. He had to understand. He did something he hadn't done in 3 decades. He looked up to 2 men who had been on the dock with him that night. The first, a man named Jimmy, he found easily. He was a successful contractor, living in a large house in the suburbs of Brookline. Michael called him, his heart pounding. Jimmy? It's Michael Callahan. There was a long, cold silence on the other end of the line. Michael said, his voice low, I need to ask you something. Have you talked to anyone about that night? Jimmy's reply was a harsh, angry hiss. Are you crazy? I haven't said a word about that night to anyone, ever, and neither should you. You forget it happened. You hear me? You forget it, or we all go down. The line went dead. The second man, a troubled kid named Kevin, was harder to find. He had drifted, fallen into a life of petty crime and addiction. Michael finally found a record of him. In a public database. An obituary. Kevin had died of an overdose 6 years ago. So it wasn't Jimmy. It wasn't Kevin. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle came to him not through research, but through a memory, a detail from the confession. The voice, the strange, flat, neutral voice. He had heard it before. But where? He went to the church archives, a small, dusty room in the rectory basement. He pulled out the old parish records, the logs of baptisms, weddings, and funerals. He went back 30 years. And he found it. The funeral service for the boy from the dock. The boy whose name was Sean. The service had been small, private. Sean had been an only child, but he had an uncle. An uncle who had been his legal guardian. An uncle who had been a quiet, strange, intensely religious man. A man who, after the funeral, had come to the church, to the confessional, to talk to the priest at the time. A man who had been obsessed with the idea of his nephew's unconfessed sins. Michael stared at the old handwritten record, and he remembered. He remembered the uncle, a gaunt, shadowy figure at the funeral, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. He had seen him. Only once, but he had never forgotten his face or his voice. The man in the confessional hadn't been a ghost. He hadn't been a witness from that night. He had been something far worse. He had been the echo of the victim's grief. A man who had spent 30 years piecing together the story, who had likely stalked and listened to Jimmy and Kevin, who had found their weak points and broken them, forcing the story out of them piece by agonizing piece. A man who had then found Michael, the one who had hidden himself in the robes of the church, and had decided that a simple accusation was not enough. He wanted to force a confession. He wanted to become the ghost of Michael's own conscience. Michael sat in the dusty, silent archive, the old book open in his lap. The horror wasn't that his secret was out. The horror was that it had been out for years, a story being meticulously researched by a patient, silent hunter. He had not been confessing to a priest. He had been confessing to a victim. A floorboard creaked in the hallway above him, the sound of a slow, deliberate footstep. He wasn't alone in the rectory. He looked up from the book, his eyes wide with a new, final, and absolute terror. The hunt wasn't over. The man hadn't gotten what he wanted in the confessional. He hadn't gotten absolution. He had just confirmed the facts. And now, he had come back to collect the penance.
Tell me your dream.
Our final story is about the sanctity of the mind. It's about the one place we believe is truly our own. The private, locked room of our own consciousness. Our own nightmares. It comes from a therapist named Dr. Aris Thorne, a man who spent his life helping children navigate the labyrinth of their own trauma. He learned, in the most intimate and terrifying way possible, that sometimes the key to your most secret room is not in your own pocket. Sometimes it is held in the small, silent hand of a new patient who has come not to be healed, but to become a living mirror of a horror you thought you had buried forever. Dr. Aris Thorne's professional life was a fortress of calm. His practice, located in a quiet, historic brownstone on Beacon Street in Boston's Back Bay, was a sanctuary for children in crisis. At 45, Aris was one of the most respected child psychologists in the city, a man known for his gentle demeanor, his preternatural patience, and his almost uncanny ability to connect with children who had locked themselves away from the world. His office was a carefully constructed haven. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, shelves filled not with intimidating textbooks, but with art, supplies, and toys. He created a world of safety for others because his own internal world was anything but. Aris had a nightmare. One nightmare. It had been his silent, nocturnal companion for over 30 years. It was always the same. He is a small boy, standing on a rocky, windswept shore on the coast of Maine. A storm is gathering. Before him, a tall, crumbling lighthouse stands like a stone skeleton against a bruised, purple sky. He is not alone. His younger brother, Leo, is with him. They are inside the lighthouse, climbing the spiraling stone staircase. The air is cold, smelling of salt and decay. There is a missing step on the staircase, a dark, treacherous gap they must jump over. At the top, in the lantern room, the storm rages outside, and then the heavy iron door slams shut, the bolt sliding home with a deafening final clang. He is locked in. Leo is gone, and a voice, a deep, familiar voice filled with a cold, unforgiving anger, begins to call his name from the other side of the door. He always woke up at that moment, his heart a frantic drum, the smell of salt and the sound of the foghorn still clinging to him like a shroud. This nightmare was his most private secret. It was the ghost of a real trauma, a childhood event so painful that his mind had walled it off, leaving only the nightly symbolic replay. He had never spoken of it to anyone. Not his ex-wife, not his own therapist. It was his personal, sacred wound, the engine of his empathy, the reason he dedicated his life to helping children slay their own dragons. His life outside. His practice was as sterile as his office was warm. He lived alone in a minimalist condo in the Seaport District, a place of glass and steel that offered panoramic views of a harbor he could never quite bring himself to enjoy. He had his work, and he had his nightmare. That was the entirety of his world. The boy who would shatter that world arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in October. His name was Samuel. He was 10 years old, a recent placement in a foster home in Newton, a quiet suburb west of the city. His file was thin, heavily redacted. It spoke of a significant traumatic event and elective mutism. He had not spoken a single word in 3 months. He was brought in by his foster mother, a kind but weary-looking woman named Mrs. Gable. Samuel was small for his age, with a shock of dark, unruly hair and large, dark eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in the room without reflecting any of it back. He was a black hole of a child. For the first few sessions, they sat in silence. Aris knew better than to push. He simply provided a safe, quiet space. He would work on his own notes, and Samuel would sit in the small armchair, utterly motionless, just watching. Aris's patience was a deep, professional well. He would wait. In their third session, Aris brought out the art supplies. He said gently, placing a large sketch pad and a box of charcoal pencils on the small table between them. Sometimes, it's easier to draw what we're feeling than to say it. For an hour, Samuel just stared at the blank page. Then, in the final minutes of the session, he picked up a charcoal pencil. His movements were slow, deliberate. He began to draw. His first drawings were abstract, chaotic scribbles of dark, angry lines. Aris recognized them as pure, unprocessed trauma. It was a start. Over the next few weeks, the drawings continued. They were always dark, always chaotic. Then, one afternoon, Samuel drew something different. He worked with a feverish, focused intensity that Aris had never seen before. At the end of the session, he silently pushed the sketch pad across the table. Aris looked down at the drawing, and the air left his lungs. It was the lighthouse. It wasn't a child's drawing. It was a detailed, architecturally precise rendering of a specific, crumbling lighthouse on a rocky shore. The artist had captured the exact pattern of the missing bricks near the top. The specific, jagged crack that ran down its western face. The unique, wrought iron pattern of the lantern room's railing. It was the lighthouse from his nightmare, the one he had not seen in person since he was 10 years old. Aris stared at the drawing, his professional composure a thin, fragile veneer over a chasm of pure shock. He could feel a cold sweat on his forehead. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. Maine was famous for its lighthouses. Samuel had probably seen a picture of one. Aris said, his voice a strained imitation of calm. This is a very good drawing. Samuel. It's a beautiful lighthouse. Do you know where it is? Samuel just looked at him with those empty, dark eyes and gave a single slow shake of his head. Aris took a picture of the drawing with his phone. That night, he fell down a rabbit hole of online research. His hands shaking as he typed. He searched for images of every lighthouse on the coast of Maine. After 2 hours, he found it. Pemaquid, Point Light. The photo was from a tourist website, but it was a perfect match for the drawing and for the ghost that lived in his own mind. The crack in the wall, the railing, everything. He read the history. The lighthouse had been decommissioned in the 1930s. It was a historic landmark, but the tower itself had been closed to the public for over 50 years due to structural instability. There was no way Samuel could have been inside. The next session was a week later. Aris was on edge, a feeling he was not used to. Samuel came in and, without a word, went straight to the sketchpad. This time, he drew the interior. He drew a spiraling stone staircase, and he left a single, horrifying, blank space in the middle of the ascent, a missing step. The coincidence was now a statistical impossibility. The boy was drawing the specific, secret architecture of Aris's own trauma. A new, terrifying, and deeply unprofessional thought began to form in Aris's mind. Was this a connection? A shared psychic wound? Was this boy this silent, broken child, somehow dreaming his dreams? He had to know. He decided to break one of the cardinal rules of his profession. He decided to lead the witness. Aris said, his voice a low, quiet murmur. "That's a scary staircase, Samuel. It feels cold in there. I can almost smell the salt." Samuel stopped drawing. He looked up at Aris, and for the first time, a flicker of something, of recognition, of connection, appeared in his dark, empty eyes. Aris continued, his heart pounding, his words a desperate gamble. "And the FOGHORN. It's so loud, isn't it? That sad, lonely sound." Samuel's lower lip began to tremble. A single tear rolled down his cheek. He picked up the charcoal pencil and, in a messy, childish scrawl at the bottom of the drawing, he wrote his first words to Aris. The note said, "He locks the door." The fortress of Aris's professional. Detachment shattered. The boy wasn't just dreaming his dream. He was living in it. This was no longer a therapeutic relationship. It was a haunting. But the ghost wasn't in the room. It was in the shared, impossible space between their two minds. Aris knew he was in dangerous territory. His duty was to the child. His own trauma was irrelevant. But how could he help a boy who was being terrorized by his own private nightmare? He decided he had to understand the source of the leak. This wasn't supernatural. It couldn't be It had to be a real-world, logical connection. He began a frantic, obsessive investigation into Samuel's past. He called Mrs. Gable, the foster mother, asking careful, probing questions. He learned that Samuel had been found as a runaway in Boston's South Station, a few months before he was placed with her. Before that, his history was a patchwork of short-term foster placements and redacted files. There was no record of him ever having been to Maine. Aris started noticing other things, small, impossible details. In one session, Samuel, while drawing, began to hum. It was a simple, slightly off-key tune. A tune Aris knew. It was a forgotten folk song his own mother used to hum while she was gardening, a song he hadn't heard in 30 years. Another time, Samuel, frustrated with a drawing, let out a sigh and muttered a single strange curse word. Under his breath. It was an old, obscure Irish curse, a phrase his own estranged Boston Irish father used to use constantly. The connections were too intimate, too specific. This wasn't a psychic link. This was learned behavior. Someone was feeding this information to the boy. Someone who knew the intimate sensory details of Aris's entire life. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle came during what would be their last session. Aris had decided he had to end their therapeutic relationship. He was too compromised, too close to the source of the trauma. He was about to tell Samuel that he would be referring him to another colleague when the boy looked up at him, his dark eyes suddenly clear, focused, and full of a cold, adult intelligence. "Samuel," said, his voice no longer the whisper of a frightened child, but a flat, calm, knowing statement. "You're going to give up on me, aren't you? Just like you gave up on Leo." The name hit Aris like a physical blow. Leo, his younger brother, the one who had been with him in the lighthouse that day, the one whose name he had never, ever spoken in this office. Aris whispered, the last of his composure gone. "How do you know that name?" "He told me," Samuel said simply. "He tells me everything. He tells me about the lighthouse. He tells me about the missing step. He tells me about the storm." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And he told me about the man who locked the door, the man with the scar on his chin. Your father." Aris stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He was looking at a 10-year-old boy, but he was seeing the face of a monster. He didn't remember the drive. He just remembered the roar of the engine, the blur of the city, the frantic, desperate need for an answer. He drove to Brookline, to the quiet suburban street where his father, a man he had not spoken to in over a decade, lived. He found his father in the garden, a stooped old man who looked surprised, and a little afraid to see him. "Maurice, what is it? What's wrong?" Maurice said, the words a raw, ragged tear in the quiet afternoon. "The lighthouse, you have to tell me what happened that day. You have to tell me everything." His father's face, a mask of old, buried grief, seemed to crumble, and he told him. He told him the secret he had carried for 35 years. Maurice hadn't been an only child who had lost a brother. He had been one of 3. There was an older half-brother, a product of his father's first failed marriage, a boy who had been given up for adoption long before Maurice was born. A secret, a ghost in their family tree. His father had only recently found him through an online genealogy service, Ancestry.com. His name was Thomas. And he had a son, a 10-year-old boy named Samuel. The world tilted and fell away. The boy in his office wasn't a patient. He was his nephew. His father whispered, his voice choked with a lifetime of regret. "Thomas," he was angry. "He found me." He said I abandoned him. He wanted to know everything about the life he never had. About you. About Leo. I told him things. I was trying to connect with him. I told him about the accident. About the lighthouse. I told him everything. The final, horrifying truth clicked into place. The boy's father, the lost brother, the man filled with a lifetime of resentment, had found his revenge. He had been systematically, cruelly, feeding his own son, Samuel, the intimate, terrifying details of Maurice's most private trauma. The boy's traumatic event hadn't been a random act of violence. It had been a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological indoctrination. His father had turned him into a living weapon, a perfect, innocent-looking vessel for a poison that was aimed directly at the heart of Maurice's sanity. The shared nightmare wasn't a psychic connection. It was a script that a little boy had been forced to memorize. Maurice left his father's house in a daze. The monster in his story wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a psychic child. It was a man, his own brother, a stranger who had decided to burn down the family he had never been a part of, using his own son as the match. He is no longer Samuel's therapist. The case is now in the hands of social services, a quiet, bureaucratic horror story playing out in confidential files. But Maurice is left with a terrible, unanswerable question. He spent his life helping children who were haunted by their past. But what do you do with a child who is being actively haunted by their present? How do you save a boy whose own father is the monster? A monster who is patiently, methodically, turning his own son into a living ghost. The nightmare is no longer in the past. It is real, it is ongoing, and it is waiting for its next session. A stranger on a bus who knows your childhood guilt. A corporation that weaponizes your trauma. A text message from an omniscient observer. A corporation observer. Confession that mirrors your own. And a therapist's nightmare walking into his office. These 5 stories, though vastly different, are all born from the same terrifying premise: the complete and utter annihilation of privacy. We build walls around our secrets, walls of silence, of time, of denial. We believe these vaults are impenetrable, that our deepest, darkest truths are ours and ours alone. But these accounts serve as a chilling testament to a new kind of horror. A horror where the monster isn't a ghost, but information. A world where data is a weapon, where every forgotten digital breadcrumb, every whispered conversation, every buried family trauma can be unearthed, collated, and used against you. The true terror here is not the knowledge itself, but the power it grants. It leaves us with a question that is both ancient and terrifyingly modern. In a world where there are no more secrets, what is left of the self? If these stories made you think about the secrets you keep, prove your own are still safe by subscribing to Whispered Fear, leaving a like, and sharing this video. Your support helps us investigate the ghosts in a machine. But what if the person who knows your deepest secret is not a stranger, What if it's the one person you're forced to confront every single day? Click the video on your screen now for our next reflection. 3 true horror stories of looking in the mirror and seeing the wrong reflection. See you there. If you recognize the person looking back,